Okay, so we left off talking about the models of serial killers, okay, the FBI's organized, disorganized dichotomy, and then also the Holmes and Holmes model based upon motivation. What I want to do now is talk about the possible causes or risk factors of serial killing. So we'll talk about the anatomy or aspects of the anatomy that might be relevant. We'll talk about childhood experiences, and I'll briefly talk about the role of mental illness. But keep in mind that the risk factors we've already discussed that predispose someone to violence are still going to be relevant, okay? The neurotransmitters and the hormones that we discussed and the aspects of the brain, okay, they're still important aspects, as well as the attachment issues and developmental risk factors we discussed. Okay, serial killers typically begin their kills in 20s or 30s, usually mid to late 20s for male serial killers is the starting point. But their fantasies of cruelty and sexuality typically began much earlier, usually in the teenage years, if not in childhood. They were mostly shy in childhood, lonely, highly sensitive children, and they felt a great fear of rejection and feeling unloved. Not too surprising, we already looked at the fact that abuse was common and so was neglect, okay? If you are raised by someone who is persistently abusing you, unsurprisingly, you're not going to grow up thinking the world is a loving place, okay? You're going to grow up thinking that, relationships are based upon fear and hate, okay? They often harbored hostility, usually initially at particular people or a person, so usually an abusive or neglectful parent, for example. But then eventually they would generalize the hostility to people at large, okay? So they, began to create a kind of self-victim narrative, that they were unseen by the world, that they were outcast, that it was them against the world, okay? That everyone was constantly trying to keep them down. And again, many have been severely physically and sexually assaulted. Now, when we looked at the Romanian orphanages, we saw some negative consequences in terms of their development. And we said it was hard to generalize because the conditions were so severe, they were so bad, okay? But in terms of the upbringing of serial killers, their situations also were quite often very unique, okay? They too often experienced, very extreme levels of abuse and neglect and unusual childhood experiences. I touched upon this before, but many were sons of prostitutes and lived in, single room motels, watching their mothers with clients. Many had domineering mothers who kind of over-coddled them and was overly smothering. But really, there was one of two extremes that was quite common in terms of the upbringing of serial killers. They would have a mother who was incredibly abusive and neglectful, okay, who didn't make the child feel safe at home, who made them feel insecure about themselves and would have had a negative impact on their attachment. Or on the other end, they were incredibly affectionate and incredibly involved in their life, okay? In some cases, they would share a bed through childhood, even into the teenage years, okay? So an overly close relationship that just really wasn't healthy for development. And there's been quite a lot of focus from the research on what the contribution may have been of these son-mother relationships in terms of later serial killing. One view is that these repressed feelings towards one mother, so repressed hostility, okay, that the individual didn't voice themselves to their mother, but again, repressed, okay, their resentment towards them. This acted as a kind of precursor or an incitement towards the killing of women later in life. Another has said that the killing was kind of a projection of the mother-son relationship onto the victims. We can certainly see a number of case study examples in which serial killers had extremely challenging relationships with their mother. Many of them even murdered their mother. Edmund Kemper, a well-known serial killer you might know from the show Mindhunter, if you've seen it on Netflix. He turned himself into police, but not until after killing his mother, who was his final victim. Okay. After killing his mother, he removed her vocal cords and then put them down the garbage disposal in the kitchen. And when asked why he did it, he said, for how much she shouted at me my whole life, it just seems fitting. Okay. And he also said at one point that he always knew he was eventually going to kill her. I should maybe say there's been some psychoanalytic perspectives on this, okay, from the Freudian school of thought, looking at, for example, an unresolved epidural complex, okay. Now, this part of Freud's theory has been criticized, but Erik Erikson made some amendments that made it a bit more palatable and kind of easier to understand. But the idea here is that there is a point in the child's development in which they feel as though the mother really belongs to them. Okay, the mother is to serve their needs. They're an extension of them. They're the one who feeds them and so on, looks after them. The mother isn't really a person in their own right. But eventually the child has to learn to separate themselves from their mother, that the mother has their own needs and desires, that the mother is their own person, okay? They're not purely an extension of the child. They are just to fulfill the child's needs. If that complex isn't resolved, then potentially the individual could grow up feeling a kind of entitlement to whatever woman they want and kind of great intensity when it comes to not getting their way or rejection. There's a documentary called Crumb from '94. You can find it online. It's mainly about Robert Crumb, who's a fairly well-known cartoonist and graphic novel designer. But the documentary talks about his upbringing and his two brothers. Now, Robert Crumb writes stories that are somewhat disturbing in nature, kind of mostly about men torturing and murdering women in kind of very unusual situations. But he seems to be healthy in terms of having his life together. He's married and has a child, and so whatever issues he has, he seems to have found a kind of safe outlet in terms of his work. But the two brothers of his, who are also in the documentary, one is a convicted serial rapist, and the other has lived at home his whole life and eventually commits suicide, not wanting really to confront his sexuality. And the documentary goes into their kind of challenging relationships with women and also with their mother, and it's a pretty clear illustration of the epidural complex in terms of the Freudian perspective. But also Freud had another term, which was the epidural mother, who is someone who doesn't feel love outside the mother-son relationship, okay? That they need the son to be somewhat emotionally crippled and dependent upon them. They don't want the son to kind of go outside the home and live their own life, okay? So this is a mother who doesn't have affection from anyone other than her son, okay? And so we can kind of see that as well in some examples of serial killers who maybe have had a kind of overly affectionate, unhealthy relationship in terms of the mother-son relationship. Yeah. Not as clearly. You know, Freud did have the Electra complex, which is kind of the female version. But obviously there's less cases to look at in terms of serial killers to look for those kinds of examples. But as a generalization, I would say that not only do girls seem to be a bit more resilient to neglect early in life, but they also seem to be a bit more resilient to unhealthy relationships with the father in comparison to sons with the mother. Not just in terms of antisocial behavior, but also in terms of relationships later in life as well. Some other common-ish childhood experiences for serial killers. Setting fires, sometimes a precursor to serial murder, as is animal cruelty. Sometimes an outlet for rage, okay? If you're abused as a child, you're not able to confront your abuser, okay? And so sometimes you might have to find some other outlets for your anger. A defenseless animal might be one possible outlet, okay? Setting fires is also potentially another. We'll talk more about that when we talk about fire setters, though, in a couple of weeks. According to one FBI special agent, killing animals is kind of rehearsal later people. In one study of 45 violent offenders, 56% that they had acted cruelly towards animals at some point. And those who had abused animals were more likely themselves to have been abused as children. Okay. Yeah. What we'll see when we look at fire setting is that fire setting is usually one symptom, if you like, of a conduct disorder. Usually there's a whole range of antisocial behaviors that are kind of an outburst for anger. Fire setting is one. It's not really actually on its own a good predictor just for homicide, but maybe more for antisocial behavior in general. So that's some early environmental experiences, okay, that are shared amongst many serial killers. There's also some commonalities when we look at the anatomy. Remember the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that's involved in problem solving, language, executive functions, okay, cognitive flexibility and inhibition, impulse control, self-awareness, self-control. The temporal lobe, on the other hand, contains many of the limbic structures, okay? So the amygdala, hippocampus, okay, parts of the reptilian brain, called that because it's the older part of the brain. They're to do more with basic emotions. I'll talk more about that when we talk about psychopathy. But just out of interest, in one study, violent offending was associated with frontal lobe dysfunction, okay, which we've already seen. It's the best replicated biological predictor of antisocial behavior, but particularly for violence. Whereas temporal lobe dysfunction in this study was associated with non-violent sexual offending. Okay, so looking up illegal pornography, for example, or incest if it was consensual. But if there was dysfunction in both regions, then that was associated with sexually motivated homicide or sexually motivated violence. So that would include rape and also sexually motivated murders. Now, this is really just a reminder because we covered this in the first couple of weeks, but the prefrontal cortex is the very frontal part of the frontal lobe. That's been highlighted as a mediator of violent behavior, okay? The angel on your shoulder, the brakes on the car, okay? The part of you that kind of stops you from giving in to that impulses, that tells you, no, don't do that. That has a lid on your more basic animalistic desires, okay? That keeps a lid on the hot-blooded emotions of the limbic system. The limbic system, an older part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex being a newer, more recently evolved part of the brain, okay? That's to do more with higher cognitive functions, executive functions, keeping a control on the more animalistic parts of ourselves. We've already looked at the fact that there's a correlation between prefrontal cortex dysfunction and violent offending. But maybe surprisingly, there are an overwhelming number of violent offenders who have traumatic brain injury when we look at samples within prisons of violent offenders. You can find plenty in cases of serial killers. I guarantee that most serial killer cases you look at, you'll find some early evidence of traumatic brain injury. John Wayne Gacy, for example, developed a blood clot on the brain after being hit by a swing as a child. Errol Nelson was in a coma for nearly a week after crashing headfirst in a biking accident. Arthur Shawcross, who we looked at briefly with the XYY profile. Was hospitalized 4 times in his childhood for head injuries, okay? And that's just the time that he was hospitalized for that we know about. What about if one is persistently abused? How many, traumatic brain injuries are they suffering from then, or maybe not being hospitalized? Henry Lee Lucas, once beaten so badly by his mom, he was in a coma for 3 days. In one study, 14 juveniles who were on death row in the US were examined for evidence of head injury. 100% of them had some sort of traumatic brain injury in their past, okay? About 12 of them had also been abused early on, and about 9 of them had really serious neuropsychological deficits. Okay. This is a pretty good TED talk that talks about, again, the kind of surprising connection that there is between brain injury and crime. I don't think I'll have time to play it, but it's in the slides, it's on Canvas, so you can watch it in your own time, but I recommend checking it out. But we talked, remember, in the first couple of weeks about the difference between reactive and proactive killers, and that the frontal lobe dysfunction was only found in the reactive killers, okay? Not surprising, okay? Remember, I showed you multiple murderers who had frontal lobe dysfunction, and then a multiple murderer, okay, who had good frontal lobe function. The image I showed you was of Randy Kraft, okay? The freeway killer who killed 64 people over a 12-year period in California, in Oregon. He had an IQ of 129. He graduated college majoring in economics, worked as a computer consultant in Orange County, California, okay? So someone who was intelligent, okay, managed to evade capture from police for 12 years and get away with a number of crimes. It's not surprising he would have good prefrontal cortex functioning because he has good executive function. But he was still a killer. So if he has normal frontal lobe functioning, then why did he go on to commit 64 murders? Well, when we look at the normal controls, reactive killers, okay, so those who commit crimes that are disorganized, okay, that are spontaneous, impulsive, and comparison also to the proactive killers, which remember are more cold-blooded, calculating, premeditated killings, right? It's not surprising that in this study there is poor prefrontal cortex functioning in the reactive killers or affective killers. Whereas there is good prefrontal cortex functioning between the normal controls and the proactive or predatory killers, okay? But also if we look at these subcortical regions, so this is deeper in the brain, in the limbic system, particularly we're looking at the thalamus and hypothalamus, which are part of the network for experiencing anger, okay? What we find here is very good functioning in both groups of killers, okay? So Randy Kraft, Ted Bundy, organized killers who were able to disguise themselves and appear like the nice neighbor next door, okay? Were able to plan out their killings so that they didn't get captured easily in comparison to 90% of killers who only kill once and are caught, okay? They were the exception who have good prefrontal cortex functioning. But deeper in the brain, we see, again, a propensity for deep emotions, okay? A great potential for anger. So in Randy Kraft's example, for instance, even though he appeared normal to people, he was described as being polite and well-mannered and soft-spoken, okay? Beneath the surface, there was something much more monstrous, okay? He was capable of great rage, okay? But unlike the reactive killers who reacted then and there, he decided to get even in a more calculated manner, okay? That would allow him to get away with his crime. So The more reactive killers, right, have these well-functioning subcortical regions that are giving rise to deep emotions such as rage. And because of their prefrontal cortex dysfunction, they're getting caught easier, okay, and are committing crimes that are more haphazard and impulsive. The more proactive predatory killers have the same level of subcortical functioning, okay, feelings of anger, but the prefrontal cortex allows them to carry out their crimes differently. Any questions on anything there? So that's some environmental risk factors, okay, and some biological, anatomical risk factors. But keep in mind, the ones we've already discussed will also be relevant, okay? The serotonin deficiency and higher testosterone baseline and lower resting heart rates. I'll briefly acknowledge the role of mental illness, okay? I don't want to put too much importance on it. First of all, people who are mentally ill are far more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators, okay? So we should be careful not to stigmatize those who are mentally ill. The second of all, there is a clear skewness in the data because people who are imprisoned are more likely to come into contact with the mental health system and are more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness. So if we're comparing rates of mental illness within forensic populations in comparison to the general population, that's going to be one big factor explaining why there might be a difference, okay? But also most mental illnesses on their own are not really a significant risk factor, okay? There are plenty of cases in which, yes, mental illness might have played a part, you know, cases of dementia or post-traumatic stress disorder in which one was confused and maybe committed a crime as part of that confusion. But these tend to be pretty unique cases, okay? If we compare as a general group, people with dementia, you know, they don't commit crimes at a substantially higher rate than people who don't. And so it's not a risk factor on its own. Psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder are the two disorders most clearly tied to crime that we'll talk about later when we have a whole week on psychopathy. Two other mental disorders that I'll briefly mention, also tied to crime to a lesser extent, but still somewhat, is paranoid schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder. Now, first of all, less than 1%, about 0.5% of convicted serial killers are actually declared insane, okay? The benchmark for insanity is a difficult one. You have to demonstrate that you didn't have control over what you were doing, or you didn't realize that what you were doing was wrong. Most serial killers do not fall under this category, okay, despite what you might think from, you know, media portrayals and so on. But two disorders that have been somewhat brought up are, first of all, borderline personality disorder, particularly in female forensic populations, okay? About 6% of the general population in terms of women have this. And female criminals, we see a higher rate, and it varies greatly from sample to sample, but, you know, somewhere between a quarter to half of criminal female offenders are diagnosed with this disorder. The other one is paranoid schizophrenia. About 1 in 20,000 people commit homicide, but in terms of those who have schizophrenia, it's about 0.3%. So still a minimal number of that sample, okay? But it's substantially higher than the general population. Now, the first two types of the Holmes and Holmes model, the visionary missionary killers, okay, I said would probably fall somewhere high on the schizophrenia spectrum, okay? The other types were more psychopathic, and we'll talk about psychopathy a bit later. But with schizophrenia, there could indeed come some delusions, okay, paranoia, hallucinations, then some unique cases have been tied to the motivations that might have tilted one to committing violent crimes. Yeah. No, they're just looking for violence, regardless of whether it was um, during a state of confusion. It probably would be, right? If one is unmedicated in terms of being a paranoid schizophrenia, that would make it more likely, of course. um, okay, one model I'll mention is Hickey's trauma control model of serial murder. It's a model that tries to acknowledge the kind of variation that there is in why some people react differently to different experiences and the number of factors that go into contributing to serial killing. You know, there are predisposing factors, okay? Differences in neurotransmitters, differences in hormones, differences in brain structures, differences in brain functionality, many of the things we've talked about. And this could impact how people respond to traumatic events in terms of why they might behave differently. It's a basic model or a simplified illustration, but Boyce's 2019 theory is that some children are orchids and some children are daffodils in terms of their temperamental makeup. Those who are orchids require a more positive experience in order to flourish. Okay, they're more sensitive by nature. They're more vulnerable to more negative scenarios such as abuse and neglect. Whereas other children are dandelions, okay, meaning that they can withstand even extremely negative consequences and are more resilient by nature, okay, and so will still have more positive developmental outcomes, won't be so likely to fall victim to the negative outcomes that have been associated. So that can impact why people might react differently to different traumatic events early in life. But traumatic events early in life, such as, again, persistent abuse, can lead to low self-esteem, okay? If you're neglected and feel unloved, that can make you feel kind of unwanted and as though you don't belong in the world or no one really cares about you. It can begin unhealthy fantasies, okay, which might also play in with disassociation. Quite often, these serial killers as children would retreat into their own heads and they would fantasize about a better life, a better world, okay? Often they would fantasize about getting even with their abusers, so their fantasies were violent in nature, okay? And then that became a coping strategy for dealing with situations in which they were upset with someone, okay? And so they had a kind of likelihood of falling back onto violent fantasies to deal with their issues that would become increasingly more and more violent. Of course, there's a number of things that can facilitate these violent fantasies, okay? Isolation, for example, exposure to certain media. Ted Bundy said if it wasn't for the violent pornography he watched, he wouldn't ever have become a serial killer. And whether that's true or not, it probably is the case that for some people, the kind of sexualized violence that they might see in pornography or in the media might awaken something in them that they didn't realize was quite there, and they might have them continue down a pathway that they might not have otherwise. Also, the kind of fame that comes, or infamy rather, that comes with being a serial killer, right? Again, many of them felt unseen, wanted to be seen, okay? There maybe came a point where they thought, I've evaded police capture for so long, I've, claimed so many victims that I'll reach headlines. Ted Bundy, Paul Bernardo, these serial killers received hundreds of love letters and proposals from people all over North America. Even serial killers like Ed Gein, who, if you look up, I'm sure you'll agree, isn't George Clooney. He also got requests for his hair from women and love letters and, you know, proposals. Richard Ramirez married one of his so-called fans in San Quentin prison. Okay, so for a lot of these serial killers, they do receive attention like they've never received before once they're caught. Okay, and then future traumatic experiences, like I say, will have it so that the person is returning to their developed coping mechanism, okay, which is their fantasies. We know even in adulthood, serial killers, when upset, are less likely to seek out social support or use a healthy coping mechanism. They're indeed, again, more likely to fantasize about a better alternative, a better life, and use their fantasies in order to try and feel better, okay? So that does seem to be a kind of persistent, unhealthy coping mechanism that's used. I might play this interview at the end if there's time, but otherwise, again, you can check it out. It's Jeffrey Dahmer talking about some early experiences. I recommend the Netflix show about Jeffrey Dahmer. I think it's fairly true in some regards, and it does kind of acknowledge the wide range of issues at play. His father was a consultant on the show, and he doesn't really hold back on his own perceived shortcomings as a father. And even in the interview, his father is also there and talks about some of his own perceived shortcomings. I would take what Dahmer says with some grain of salt in the interview. He talks about, you know, being newly converted and having found God, and he thinks that not having a religious upbringing was a big part of why he became a killer. There's a lot of skepticism over whether he was genuine in terms of his later religious convictions. So I've talked about some biological, environmental risk factors. I also want to talk about some of the cognitive aspects we looked at in the first module as well. Now, again, these are common distortions, okay, faulty thinking patterns that have been found to be common to these samples. In this study, they've looked at rapists and sexual murderers. They've interviewed them, taken a note of their cognitive distortions, their unhealthy thinking styles, and then they've placed them into one of 5 categories, okay? The category that best explains their most prominent distortions, okay, and the most prominent faulty thinking styles. So, you know, again, remember, these are reflective of core beliefs, okay, that maybe are a result of an unhealthy upbringing, or maybe a product sometimes of cognitive dissonance, trying to create a narrative that's self-serving, okay? Interestingly, in this study, there was little differences between the rapists and the sexual murderers, with the exception of the final group, which I'll come to. The first group predominantly had thoughts to do with the world being a dangerous place, okay? That it was a dog-eat-dog world, okay? That they had been victimized in the past, that they don't want to be victimized again. If you don't want to be victimized, you have to be the one who's victimizing others. A kind of preoccupation with dominance and control and power, okay? That was the things that were most important to them, okay? And they were kind of evaluating relationships based upon how much power they had in them. The second category was that the male sex drive is uncontrollable. They felt as though there was an overwhelming biological desire to do what they did, that it couldn't have been helped, that it was always going to happen at some point, okay, that they weren't blaming themselves. It was due to issues outside their control. It was just the way it was, the way that they were built, perhaps. The third group held views of women being inferior to men, and really that women were only really there to serve men and to kind of be objects for men in terms of, you know, gratification, that they didn't really see women as equals to men. Persistently, you know, from early in their life across their adulthood. The fourth group felt entitled to sex or to take what they wanted in the moments in which they did. Okay, so their entitlement was more situation specific. It was less lifelong and persistent than the negative attitudes of the third group who merely viewed women as sex objects. For the group who felt entitlement, they felt as though the women had flirted with them, had spoken to them in a way that made them think that they were interested, and then the man was entitled to sex, or the women had dressed in a particular way, or the man had paid for a date, and so he felt entitled to sex. That was some of the justifications that they were giving for their rape and behavior. Now, these four distortions were common to both groups of rapists and sexual murderers, okay? Sexual murderers being those who rape their victims and then murder them afterwards. But the final group was only common to the sexual murderers, not common to the rapists, okay? That women are unknowable. That for them, they felt as though there was no consistency to how women behaved around them, that they could never quite judge what to say or what to do, what the right behaviors were with a woman, and that this was a real point of frustration and anger for them, okay? That they never knew what women were thinking or how to act around women, that they had this idea that women were just unknowable. And so for them, that was a driving force of their anger. That again was common to the sexual murderers, not common to the rapists.